What's up, everybody? What up, world? What up, people? So I'm gonna make this my very first actual discussion video in regards to the spiritual concepts that I've created for that project I previously posted. If you haven't seen it, feel free to take a look. But today I'm gonna be discussing the intro to the yin and yang thing, and I'm gonna go into a little more detail about it in case anyone got confused. I'm in a little park just chilling. It's a really nice area. So I'll start with the yin and yang intro. So the core principles regarding yin and yang are a universal attribute of duality that every culture mentions in their stories, usually by different names or titles, for example, masculine and feminine. It is not just related to gender binaries, so it's not related specifically to genders, but genders are an example that they use in order for our brains to understand it. Our brains really only understand things by comparing and contrasting. So like black compared to white, or up compared to down, left compared to right, etc., etc. Everything in the universe has its own counterpart, and that's how we logically process things. And we find these things to be in not just our terms, but in pretty much every single language. This is pretty much our code to communicate with each other and how we exchange dialogues. It gets deeper when you realize that there is a third law, which we also use in language, and that's would be the they them, and that's where the idea of like plurals come into play, because they're a model example. If these two contrasting things were combined together, it's either a neutral or a combination, but they're of the same type of thing. It's still a contrast to each other. Those two are so closely related that they would fall more under a third category. It would fall under a different thing. Even if you say yin and yang, it's the same thing, because you got yin and yang, and then you have something, whatever it would be called when it's combined together, or when it has neither one included. Like, you could make it a law of four, but you'll find out that it just goes on for infinity. It doesn't have an actual endpoint. For ease of understanding, law of three. Yeah, as many old cultural tales have stated, the origin of life was said to be hermaphroditic. That's the third one. That's the third idea, or the combination. What would be the ideal combination of those two rivaling entities? Whatever you want to call them. Complementary, contrasting, competing, opposing, same thing. The information below will describe real-life examples of the three polarities. They are to present that fact does not exist, and that all sources of data reflected to us are based on universal patterns that we recognize, collectively agree with, and repeat. To put it simply, because these polarities exist, this is a logical proof. There is no wholeness in anything, no 100% to anything. So in math terms, right, they would say, oh, 1/1, that's a whole. It's supposed to represent 100%. What it is supposed to imply is that 100% has, a B. 100% is to represent something that is whole and complete. Like, these are all approximations. You can only estimate what a 100% would look like. Like, have you ever seen a 100% human or a whole human? No, because a human is still growing as well as shrinking, because we decompose and all that, implying that it is never complete. We are continually cycling into something else. We are continually changing into something else. There's never been something that is still and non-moving and stagnant. Everything decomposes with time. Everything changes with time. Doesn't matter what element you can think of. Everything shifts with time and changes. It's never the same thing as time goes on. And that's kind of where the model of mathematics goes wrong. It's just how our brains interpret things, because we have to limit it somewhere. What our brains limit things to is whatever we place as a model for it. If we have a model of something that is complete, it kind of removes itself from everything else around it, as if it weren't a part of that. In the same way that you could say Earth is part of space, and we can't really define space because we say it's endless. Because we can't really define space and we say it's endless, is Earth, the thing that we call Earth, separate from space? In our minds, we can think of space as being something distinctly separate from Earth, but that's only because our minds think of it that way. We don't look at it as being attached to space or connected to space, even though Earth is inside of quote unquote space, whatever that is, and we're floating through a nothing. Ooh, a black butterfly. Interesting. I got distracted. Sorry about that. But we're floating essentially on a big rock magnetically. We're magnetically floating on a big rock, trailing through nothingness, as we're also probably smacking against millions and trillions and gazillions of things that haven't destroyed us. Like, there's so many smaller and larger things that are also in space that we are constantly in contact with, that has not killed us, has not destroyed us, but may contribute to our destruction slowly. You never know. I don't know. This is where the fallacy of like language and numbers and anything else comes into play. We kind of assume that because we have our idea of what something whole is, that somehow that means these things are not connected to each other, that we're not connected to something bigger or smaller. Like, for example, a tree is connected to the earth. Even though we call it a tree, we say that a tree is what it is. It's grown through roots in the ground, but we think that the ground is separate from the tree, even though the parts of the ground are being fed into the tree that allows it to grow. Sounds funny, right? Sounds ridiculous. Well, here's the issue, right? All of mathematics, because of our models of it, assumes that there is a hole in everything. And because there is a hole in everything, everything has a limit. What we had to do to compensate for that, we started with a positive number system, and to contrast it, we needed a negative number system. To contrast a whole number system, we now needed fractions and irrational numbers and all that jazz. The irrational numbers are the closest thing to a real estimate, and even then, it's still not going to be it. You can estimate up to 0.999999, but if it's never one, then it just goes on forever. Same with 0.000000001. Same thing. It's not different at all. It's limitless both ways. Because we estimate things, we take out the model or the idea of its connection to things, everything else around it, its influence around everything else, as well as the other things' influence on it. Think of how, the same way that I just made the example of the tree. The dirt allows the tree to grow, depending on the soil and all that blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? And how the tree is still connected to the ground in order to continue growing. But even if it is knocked down, or even if it is cut down, or whatever else, that tree can still continue to grow, or it can decompose. But the decomposing does not mean it dies. Because our idea of death is that once it changes into whatever it changes into, or once it decomposes, that means it's suddenly gone. See what I'm getting at? So if the human body dies and it decomposes, isn't it just changing into something else? It doesn't mean that a decomposing of a body equals death, that somehow whatever was existing of it is completely gone. We consider inanimation to be death or non-life, but really we should count it as minimal life, but not death, because we call death the ceasing of life. Feel free to just ask me, because I could very easily explain this, because it's not that hard of a concept. Think about this, right? So imagine the picture of the cell, right? And now imagine how they always show the cell splitting in half to make a clone of itself. Now, what if that cell, as it's splitting in half, what if it's not actually fully splitting off? What if there's a very tiny thread that is still keeping it connected? And this is where the spiritual concept comes in. Like, if you've ever seen how people depict astral projection, right? They'll show people connected to a cord that is attached to their physical body, but the cord is coming out and their spiritual body is able to roam, whatever you would consider a spiritual body, or their astral form. Imagine that applies to everything. Even the math example of fractals. Fractals are just infinite layers of different things. What if layers present that everything is still connected even though it's entering into something else? And the thing that we call separation, like, things can exist in a way that is separate but connected at the same time. This is how our universe functions, but it's never in a way that is whole, uncompleted, or like limited, because what we call a limit is really just an illusion. Like, these things consist of issues of everything being the same but somehow still changing. What we call something that is the same while changing is really just a pattern. You could repeat a pattern in a different way. This is how it doesn't contradict, even while being quote unquote contradictory as a logical idea. So if I divide myself into another me, I don't know if y'all ever heard of the no cloning theorem. It's an idea that there can never be a perfect clone. Oh, you ever watch those old cartoons or like those old like movies or shows, like somebody gets an exact clone, but then they find that that clone either has like an abnormality or somehow evil compared to the original clone or something to that effect. There is never going to be the same person, place, or thing. Even right now, I'm continuously changing every minute, every second, every whatever unit of time we want to measure. Things repeat their cycles, maybe forever, we don't know, but there may come a time that there's a complete change in that pattern and that the pattern will no longer be followed, and you never know how things are going to end up. Like anything could be unpredictable, anything could change, anything can shift significantly out of its original position. And even the idea of a position is where we get the logical fallacy, because in order for a position to even make sense, you have to assume that something is in the same place, and that even if you're standing in the same spot, that somehow everything around you isn't also moving. The earth is constantly shaking because it's moving. Humans are constantly moving, even when we're trying to stay still. Because everything in existence is moving in some capacity, whether it's super slow or super fast, that means it is alive in some way, in some form. It is living and being in whatever form it is. I'm gonna see about going to the beach, and then I'm gonna see if I feel like making more later. If I do, then you'll see more of these. Peace. All right, what's up, y'all? So after several mosquito bites, we finally made it to the next phase. I have made it to a beach. Nice little area. It's not crazy, but it's actually pretty bland, but it works. So what I was last talking about was everything not being separate, or as separate as we think it is. Everything is interconnected with each other and tied, similar to the trifold knot, a threefold knot. That particular knot has been a challenge to many people throughout the years and generation, because the idea of that knot, it represents what unconditional love is, and unconditional love is supposed to be an unbreakable chain. So even if you picture that as like a threefold chain, it represents a chain that cannot be broken. There's no way to like pull it apart or anything like that. There's no logical way to do that. And that's what that knot is supposed to represent. It's the same way with everything in the cosmos universe, because we're a part of it. We're interconnected to it. I don't have to be you in order for you to be connected to me. Like, the universe does not have to be your body in order for you to be connected to the universe, and vice versa. The universe doesn't have to be the galaxy, and the galaxy doesn't have to be the solar system, and the earth does not have to be the solar system, and so on and so forth. It goes on forever. Like, the dirt doesn't have to be the trees doesn't have to be the dirt, but they're still interconnected, which means that they are one and the same, but it's not one as in this is all that there is, because it's really endless. Everything is connected to everything. It's tied together with everything, like a knot, like a string. If you were to put the label of something being complete or whole, that would also mean that it's separate from everything else, that it's its own distinct thing. Like, I am my own distinct self from you, or my phone, or outside, but yet these things are also connected to me. Like, I'm feeding it just as it's feeding me. I'm not separate from it. It's all one interconnected system that's both in and out, utilizing itself in different ways, and it's just swapping places, swapping positions. That's why, like breathing, for example, they say that we breathe in what the plants breathe out, and vice versa. It doesn't necessarily have to be true, or it's the concept of it that brings in that reversal law, the idea of just going back and forth and utilizing itself. Everything's just being recycled. There's nothing new about it. Like, it's new, but it's not new. It's pattern. Or a pattern can be, it could repeat itself in different ways. Not only is everything continuously changing, but we see things as being a whole. The truth is that numbers are just an estimate of what is otherwise infinite. And because of that, there will never be a real life replica, and it will always be the logical downfall of language. So it's like me saying every blade of grass is the same, but meanwhile, every blade of grass is its own distinct entity. And we call grass what it is because of the fact that it looks identical to other patches or other pieces or other blades of grass. But grass is not grass alone. Grass is also connected to dirt, and it's connected to the air that it's intaking. When we separate things, we can give ourselves an isolated idea of it. But when we disconnect it from the idea of its interconnectedness with everything else, we lose sight of how it works and why that label alone doesn't work to explain it, or everything else for that matter. Like, for example, my eyes are not separate from my head, even though my eyes are considered to be a part of my body. Yet at the same time, my eyes are also my body. The claim would be that my eyes are part of my body and not my body itself, but then that also separates my eyes and my body. Like, we make it sound like they're two distinct things, but yet they're interconnected. They still work certain functions in the body, and they're tied together via whatever we call nerves. Even if we cannot see it, there are so many tiny, bigger and smaller things that are connecting us to everything outside of us and inside of us. They're not distinctly separate in and of itself. And everything has a dominance in something. In the same way that things consume other things to exist, and that has always been how it is and what it will always be. Sometimes small things consume big things. Sometimes big things consume small things. Because end of the day, that's just how we survive. We need life to sustain life, and everything is alive. So therefore, we are consuming all forms of life in order to sustain individual existence, whatever we'd want to call that. So dominance is really just like a survival pattern. Like, everything tries to dominate everything in nature. Because if we didn't do that, we wouldn't survive. That's our basic fight response to consume. There is no stopping that function. Even concepts have a dominance as well. Because if things didn't have a dominance, then everything would be the same. And if everything was the same, then everything would be identical. But everything's not identical because we're not clones. We're not the exact same as everything else, even though we are interconnected with it. We live in a universe that everything can be the same while being different. That is the ultimate universal contradiction that doesn't contradict itself. But it's the only way to explain it. If everything didn't have a dominance, everything would be identical. We wouldn't have contrast. We wouldn't have differences. We wouldn't be unique in our own ways. In that same way, we can have dominant patterns. We could have dominant appearances. We can have dominant desires. It was the same reason why we were not born as total hermaphrodites, looking exactly the same, but have so many variations on the spectrum that we fall under. So if we were to logically put a simple idea to what the truth is, it will always be both true and false, yes and no, at the same time. Yes and no combined is what makes the pyramid. And keep in mind, they never totally combine, because if they did totally combine, everything would be the same, because everything would be merged together. And everything is merged while separate. That's the magic of the universe. Both coexist at the same time. And thus, no matter your conclusion, the answer comes down to your free will to choose, which whittles down to perception, aka how you see reality. Whatever you focus on is what gets split into dualities. So for example, I could look at a building, say it's a building, but then I could look at the window of a building and then say the window of a building is different from the building because of the fact that I'm focusing on the window instead of the entire building. I can say this car is a car, but then if I look at the window of the car, I'll call it a window, separating it from the car. Meanwhile, I'm not paying attention to the car anymore because this is a car window. We have to merge the words together, because if we were to use them separately, we'd think of a general idea of a window, which is a little more expansive than the limited idea of a car window. I look at a car and I look at the seat, a seat inside a car. I label the seat as a seat because it's now distinctly separate from the car because of the fact that I'm focusing on that as a separate entity, as opposed to looking at the whole car itself, because the seat is a part of the car, where the seat and the car are connected together. They make the car itself, but we look at the seat as if it's a separate thing, and that's where we get mixed up with our perception. In the same way that you can say sand and the beach are connected, even though the ocean, whatever we want to call that, and the sand, whatever we want to call that, are separate things in itself, things, right? It's connected by the fact that they're layered and paired together, not because of the fact that they're divided by an invisible line that we make up. Boom, there you go. Easy. So think of yin and yang in the circle. Imagine that they're combined together, and the only thing that separates them is the idea of a layer. They are their own distinct entities because that's how our brains understand it, but they are interconnected in the fact that they're just one circle. Yin wouldn't be yin without yang, and yang wouldn't be yang without yin. Because if one existed without the other, they would be the same because it would only be one thing. But yet we have dualities, we have contrasts, and we have differences. Boom. For example, if I focus on what we call an eye, there are bigger and smaller layers that are a part of this eye. Like if you actually look at diagrams of eyes, you'll see all the little different layers that an eye has. Everything from the pupil down to the iris and the sclera and all that. And even the thing that connects it to the brain and the rest of the body. This pattern repeats endlessly throughout the universe and beyond. Although we layer things in that way, everything mirrors that same layering pattern. This is where in mathematics they call it fractals. Fractals are just a way of saying layers. Layers and layers and layers. And an eye is not whole in itself as it's connected to other parts of our body. It's like I was saying earlier, an eye is not separate from the body, it's interconnected with the body and what is outside of the body. So this could be a scary thought. So imagine that whatever our eyes focusing upon is kind of like energetically latching to something. Even though I say energetically, it doesn't have to be a non-physical thing. It could be a physical thing of something very small that we can't see. Every time our eyes gaze onto something, maybe we're latching onto it. And that's why we might feel a pull or some kind of push or an instinct or an impulse, whatever we want to call that. That's just one idea. For example, I think there is an ancient Greek group that believed our eyes actually emitted light. Like it didn't just take in light, but it also emitted light. If what has been read here has sunken in, knowing this can reveal an unsettling truth. Not only do things exist in repeating cycles, even if they take on different forms, because nothing is ever exactly the same, but it also confirms that the things spoken about, light and dark, are both true as well. Oh, there's a bug trying to attack. Because you learn that nothing has an endpoint, this would also mean that everything exists in some way, shape, or form. So the things that were spoken about in regards to dark or negative entities, or I guess hauntings, or the idea of ghosts, or the idea of spirits, stuff like that, all of them have some semblance of truth there, and however it can manifest itself. But in that same way, the positive things also exist too. Both have to exist in order for things to maintain a state of equilibrium, because if only one side existed, then everything would be the same and there would be no distinction of any kind. Like, how would you know a person that isn't the best person if all you've experienced is people that are good? How would you know a dark entity if all you've seen is light entities or something like that? Some people will say, oh, that's just metaphysical nonsense, da da da. Even if that is what you choose to believe, there's no problem with that. But if you come across something, and I know everybody has, at some point in their lives, you come across something that disturbs you deeply. Sometimes it's a sense. Sometimes you get that sense of danger. Sometimes you just see something that may like trigger some negative feelings in you. And sometimes even that can cause negative dreams or like nightmares and hauntings. You never know how or when it's going to begin. Like, you see all these different horror movies. Maybe it's not as dramatic as that, but to say that it doesn't exist at all, I feel is naive. That these things don't exist, that they don't impact us, that we're not affected by subtle influences outside of us that we're not aware of. Because true and false, dark and light, Both have to exist. This also confirms that there are, in fact, good people, quote unquote, good, in which you have to use that term loosely because it's still a spectrum at the end of the day, but good and bad people. And what's going to determine the accuracy of that spectrum is going to be both your experiences, the depth of your perspective, how many people you've experienced in your life, how much you've read of the different types of people that exist in the world, and the ones that you've experienced overall, and the lessons that you've received as a result of encountering these people. There are some wicked people in the world just for the sake of it. It doesn't have to have a reason. It comes down to that. Like, if you're looking for an explanation, you're not always going to find a satisfying one, and sometimes you won't find one at all. Some people just do things because they can. Of course, the root of all evil comes down to unhappiness, yes, but also you don't really know what can set a person off, what can shift a person's mind and body in a way that is malevolent. Because it could be anything. It could be food, it could be exposure to something, disease. We live in a world that is without rules. The closest thing that we have to rules are karmic laws, and even then, people can still do whatever they feel. There's no true consequence to it until after they do the action. And anything man-made can be rescinded, be rejected. Anything man-made can be denied. And people can do whatever they feel. Like, yeah, we have a police system. Yes, we have a military system. We have systems of law enforcement. But the key is in that word, enforcement. You have to force somebody to stop. Which, do you really think somebody's going to stop after being forced to? Maybe, but does that mean that the thing that's going on with them is gonna magically disappear? No, it doesn't work that way. Like, the core of a person doesn't just change like that. And I'll get into something like this later, but the core of a person, while being flexible, tends to remain static. The core patterns that you existed with your entire life, coming down to your appearance, coming down to the way that you behave, the way that you think about things, a lot of that is a part of your core nature, but it's not exclusive to your core nature, because you can massively change like how you think, you can massively change how you look, but the core of you remains the same. Whatever makes up you, the person, remains, and it's simply your patterns that change. You could utilize patterns in different ways to get different results. A pattern that is harmful to you does not always have to be harmful. You could utilize a pattern in a way that is non-harmful or least harmful to you. Doesn't mean it won't be harmful to you at all, but there's always going to be that spectrum. Like, it's never going to be perfect. Nothing's ever going to be exactly the same or exactly perfect or 100% like I mentioned. Nature has an order, a structure that it functions in to maintain the balance of the universe, and our subconscious bodies are designed to follow it in order to get an ideal, healthy, and happy life. There is a universal structure to things that once you figure it out, you'll be able to kind of understand why everything else is it. Like, it comes down to that very basic principle of the yin and yang. Once you understand that truly, triality, duality, and the limitless nature of things, you'll understand why things are structured, because without a form, everything would be in a state of chaos. Nothing would maintain anything. Like, we wouldn't have a body, we wouldn't have a form of any kind. Like, our forms would be all destroyed and messed up. That is what structure is. Structure exists in order to maintain non-chaos, whatever that would look like. That is why we have a universal structure. Because if that structure were to break down, everything would be destroyed. Everything would be rearranging itself massively. And this is where, for people that have either undergone any kind of psychedelic trip, or if they've taken a high dose, or if anyone's taken ayahuasca, LSD, mushrooms, DMT, any of those things, if they have experienced what is called an ego death, or if they have seen what is called the void, these are states of chaos in which you kind of lose voluntary control of both your mind and sometimes your body. Like, in my case, when I've gone through my own personal ego deaths, it resulted in a massive chaos in my mind, but it also resulted in my body being uncontrollable. Like, The closest thing I could use to explain it is when people get super drunk and you're just hunched over, like you just feel ill, like it's that feeling. But imagine that feeling doesn't go away and it stays for a long time and you're just rolling around, you're just in a panicky state, and it just, that discomfort just doesn't go away. That's like the ego death that I experienced. And many people have gone through similar things where ego death doesn't have to get that bad, but ego death can also appear as in your worldview being just shattered, like how you viewed certain things, how you believed certain things to be true. Ego death is when that perspective gets destroyed. You have to now rebuild based on that new model of reality that has been created for you. That is what ego death is. After the chaos, a new structure is built, and everything goes through that same cycle. It's death and rebirth, death and rebirth. That's what it's about. It's dying and resurrecting. Nature undergoes these same patterns. Just as everything dies, everything eventually comes back, even if it's in a different way. And that's what I mean about the core. Like, the core doesn't disappear, but for example, the core of what created that structure doesn't die. It doesn't disappear. It's still there, but the core is flexible. The structure that it created was not. So the structure gets broken down, and the structure has to now be rebuilt into a newer, stronger structure. Otherwise, it couldn't maintain the same existence that it did before. As everything in the universe does, it has to change. Change is inevitable. It's unavoidable. If your structure is not flexible, then it's destined to just get destroyed. Anything rigid gets dented, shattered, and so on and so forth. Anything flexible is elastic. It can continue to move, it can stretch, it can remold itself into something else without being torn apart, without being destroyed, ripped, shattered. Bending requires flexibility in order to do. Bending is not an inflexibility, whereas rigidness is. That which is more rigid is more apt to be broken. That which is more flexible is more apt to change, or static versus dynamic. This structure, this order, is what we call karma. That's what karma truly is. It's not necessarily a moral law. It's more of that everything in the universe is a mirror of everything else. And once you understand that, you'll also understand that what is done onto the mirror is also being done onto the self. And that is karma. Karma is a reflection of things. It's a reflection of that which is true versus that which is untrue. Karma is simply the structure of truth versus the structure of falsity. Karma always breaks down that which is called falsity. Inevitably, any kind of falsehood gets changed, whereas that which is flexible will have quote unquote good karma because it is already changing. It doesn't fall to the rigidness of falsity. And in that same way, our bodies, our minds, and that which we call our spirits are designed to pretty much follow that, because that is nature's design. Nature's design is to follow nature. Like, that which is not of nature gets destroyed or dissolved or rejected. That which is of nature gets approved, accepted, and flows smoothly. Anything that is unnatural, and when you think about it really deeply enough, you'll find everything is of nature, but not everything is natural. And there's different reasons for why different things are inevitably going to break down and will not last forever. This is why every couple of years you gotta get a new computer, or a certain amount of decades you gotta replace a light bulb, or every century we're expected to die. That's really what nature represents, because nature has just changed. Nature is, yes, the pursuit of happiness, but not everything that makes you happy is good for you. And not everything that makes you happy is natural. Everything that is natural has no issue changing, and everything that is natural is flexible in some way. Everything that is natural, while limited, is not too limited. There's a balance between limited and unlimited. You can't be unlimited because otherwise you're in chaos constantly. And you can't be too limited because you'll be too rigid. You'll be too structured. And neither one is going to be true. Like, karma does not follow either one totally. We get signs from nature itself to follow life in a certain way. Nature pushes us in certain ways to follow a certain thing. Sometimes it's out of intuition and sometimes it's trauma. And you have to be able to discern between these things. And you'll only know by knowing the contrast of it. You'll get your experiences of these things and you'll learn your lessons. All of that is related to karma. This is why all actions have consequences. There is no action or thought that just disappears into the ethers. Everything that you say, do, and think about all have a rippling effect. Like all of these things have a karma. And that is why if you do not want those things to come back and haunt you, you don't do them. Yes, you might think negatively about certain things, but thinking negatively is not a bad thing in and of itself. Retaining thoughts of negativity and not changing them to something else, or not understanding them and why it's there, is what will cause karma, because you haven't understood yourself. That's what causes the consequence. Nothing is created or destroyed, it simply changes. And that is the crazy part. Everything is interconnected, so therefore, because nothing dies and everything is infinite, nothing can be destroyed. Nothing disappears forever, like how we were taught to believe. Like nothing really goes away like that. And in that same vein, nothing is created because it already existed. Boom. That's the magic. Even when thinking of the concept of time, that's the law of three: past, present, and future. And if it is all interconnected, the past has already happened because the future was already written. And the present is where they meet. Like you already know your destiny. You already know what you're meant to do, and you already know why you're here. On a subconscious level, you already know your destiny. The cosmos knows. With the past, present, and future being one, the reason why patterns become very important here is because everything exists in a cycle. And when you know something was done in the past, that means in the future it will be happening again in a different form. However, it doesn't have to result in the same thing that it did in the past. And that's what change is about, because change is constantly happening. And the cycle, or the repeating pattern, is where the present becomes very important in understanding between what the past and what the future will hold. This is where if you make massive changes, massive differences will happen between those cycles. Yeah, I'm probably gonna save things about that for a future discussion, because that's where you also have to be understanding what the core of a person is and how it manifests itself in this cyclical way. In the yin yang chart, keep in mind that yin and yang can swap places based on influences like daytime and nighttime conditions, or inside and outside positions. This is a basic understanding that can be seen in things repeatedly. If there is still curiosity after reading this and the other parts, you can use your intuition, experience, and research to figure out anything else. This project is not and was never meant to be perfect, but at the very least, I hope I'm able to at least provide an opportunity for people of different walks of life to start to come to a mutual understanding about spirituality and science, see that they're not so different, and in fact that they inspired each other, and everything may not be as they appear. All right, so I'm gonna get up now. God, I was in that seat for a minute, bro. The point of this project was not to be perfect in my explanations of things, but to kind of give people an idea of what it could look like, to show that things are not really as they seem, and that everything is able to change. You are able to change. People are able to change, and nothing is fixed. Nothing is so fixed that it cannot change. But you also have to understand who you are in order to know what kind of changes you are capable of, and to know how to do those changes and what you're meant to do, because like all of those things come together. So I think everyone can understand at this stage that nothing is fixed, but everything is also fixed. Everything is fixed while being unfixed. Nothing was ever at a local point. There was no like single point that everything is at, because nothing was ever still. There was no isolated point to point out. The world is still spinning. Therefore, nothing was ever at a single point. Everything is moving. The world is constantly changing. There is no such thing as anything being exactly the same. It's as that saying said about crossing the river, and after crossing the river, it was not the same river and he was not the same man. That's what it's about. Alright, I think I'm done with the beach. I'll see y'all later. Peace out.